right, and we are rolling. So let's start at the beginning and tell us how old you. First, tell us your name, and then tell us how old you are. Your name? Yes,
My
ma'am.
name
Yes, ma'am.
is Willa Jean Spikes, and I'm 89 years old. I will be 90 years old the 29th of December of this year.
So you were born in 1926. So you've seen a lot of changes.
I have seen many changes. And then the one thing I'm grateful for is that I was brought up in a Christian home. My mother and father were godly people, and we knew what it was to go to church, and we knew what it was to be saved. And early on, I surrendered my life to the Lord. But of course, years went by, and I, of course, went back and didn't live for Him as I should have. But then when I was graduating from high school, I had wanted to study medicine. And I had been accepted at Birmingham and was on my way to go to school there at AUB, or is it EUB or?
Yeah, I think it's UAB, I
UAB.
think. Yes, ma'am.
That's right.
And you wanted to study to be a doctor?
I was going to study medicine. I was going to decide. I was looking at the possibility of becoming a doctor.
Okay.
That was my long dream. And that was a dream of my family. And I was ready to go with a friend of mine who was brought up in the same community, Virginia White. And on Sunday afternoon, before we were to leave on Monday morning, the school called and said, Jean, your credits has not been sent in correctly.
From your high school?
My high school credits.
Okay.
It has not been sent in correctly. And it will be 3 months, a semester, before we could get those things straightened out and get you back in. And of course, I did have enough credits, but the school had failed to send them in correctly. And I stayed out for 3 months. My heart was broken. I thought, during that time, my entire life changed. For some time, I knew that God was speaking to my heart about some work, and I, of course, knew not what it was. But I answered the call during those 3 months. I ran as long as I could.
So when you say you answered the call, you felt in your heart specifically that God was calling you to, by this time, a certain task?
To a certain ministry.
And what was that?
The pulpit ministry. Okay. And when I knelt by my bed and I said, Lord, I surrender to you. I'm absolutely broke. And at that time, my family was not too happy about me not being a doctor, but a preacher. And of course, we knew there would be a stigma to being a preacher. And when you think about 70 years ago, it was almost unheard of.
So let's talk about that aspect of your calling. Who was the first person that you told that you felt called to preach?
I was going to tell you that.
Okay.
I'll tell you that. During the time I had just answered the call, and I said, Lord, I'm broke. I really don't know anyone, didn't know where to go or what to do. And about that time, the bishop of the Methodist Church had called for a spiritual revival simultaneous in every church in this conference.
And just remind me which conference you were in.
Alabama West Florida Conference.
Alabama West Florida, the bishop. And do you remember the bishop's name at the time?
I'm not sure what his name.
That's okay, but he called for a spiritual renewal,
Yes,
a revival.
yes. And I was waiting, praying, and one day there was a knock on my door. I was in Geneva, Alabama at the time. And this preacher that was pastor of one of our Methodist churches out from Geneva was at the door. His name was Ralph Bullington. And when he came in, first thing he said, "Jean, I really don't know why I'm here." But as I was praying about the spiritual renewal and who could come and speak for us those 4 nights, your name and your face would come before me.
Now, you had not told your family
I have not told
or your
anyone.
friends.
I have not said one word. I did not tell anyone.
Did your family have a relationship with Reverend Bullington?
He did. They did not.
Okay, all right.
They knew him, but not a relationship as
Okay.
such. And he said, "I really haven't heard that you did anything like this." And I wondered, though, would you be willing to come to my church and speak for us those 4 nights?
And this was in what year was this?
It was probably in 43.
1943. Okay.
Approximately somewhere there.
Okay.
And as he talked, I simply said, "Well, Brother Bullington, I will be willing to do that if I feel like it's the will of God." And it was not an audible voice, I cannot tell you that, but that small, still voice that I heard simply said, "This is the way, walk ye in it." And I said, "Yes." And I went and ministered those 4 nights. The first night I preached, and the first sermon was on faith. And that's really what I've lived by all these 70 years.
So let's back up just a minute. So Brother Bullington asked if you'll conduct the revival, for lack of a better term.
Yes,
That'd
it
be
was.
correct?
Yes, it was.
And your family did not know anything. So did your family think that you were just agreeing to do this one-time thing, or was it now your family understood that you felt a call to pulpit ministry?
It was just perhaps a one-time thing.
Okay.
As far as that. But another experience that I had relative to my call, I was staying with my aunt and uncle in Geneva, and across the street lived a godly woman that had watched me run from God, get sick, fight. She called me to her house and said, "Jean, I want to say something to you." And I said, "What is it, Aunt Alma?" She said, "I want to know one thing. Has God called you to preach?"
And this was before your encounter with Brother Bullington, or after?
This was before
Okay.
he had, if I'm remembering correctly.
Okay.
And I said, "Aunt Alma, who told you that?" Because I had not whispered, I had not told anyone. She said, "Jean, God has revealed that to me." And I was sick, I was running. And I'll never forget what she said to me. "The sooner you surrender, the better off you are going to be, because he is going to get you. And he will, and he did." And sure enough, I went to that Brother Bullington and preached those 4 nights. The first night I preached, 5 people were converted around the altar.
Your
The
very first sermon
I ever preached on faith. I really don't know what I did wrong, because one of them turned out to be a Baptist preacher. He got saved in the Methodist church. But I forgave him for that. And people started inviting me to speak in their churches and speak for their young people. And doors started opening.
And your parents were receptive of this?
And then I just admitted to my parents and my family that God had called me to preach and I would not be returning to school.
So you were preaching
Yes.
before you really told your parents that God had called you to preach. Is that correct?
Exactly right.
So, and how did they respond to that?
Not too favorably. They were very disappointed. And at that time, there was no women in the... I was really shocked. I didn't know. That's when I fought so hard, because of the stamina. I came from a wonderful family, and all my, just, you know, godly people and good standing and what have you. And they didn't respond favorably at that time. But I will tell you, they did accept it. And they loved me.
And were there any other, that you know of, any other women preachers in the area?
I did not.
Okay.
And I was the only one for a long time that I knew. And of course, the Methodist Church at that time did not accept women preachers.
So, meaning that they did not recognize the call, or they did not ordain?
They did not ordain or recognize the call.
But Bullington was a Methodist
He was
preacher?
a Methodist minister, and the Board of Ordained Ministers at that time, and told me, if you are invited to a church to speak, you are permitted to do that. You will have our blessings, but we do not license you. We cannot license you or ordain you. We do not accept women preachers.
Now, a couple of questions around that issue. First of all, how did that make you feel? Was that discouraging to you? Was that just the way it was and you embraced that? How did that make you feel?
You know, I don't really remember, but at that point in my life, I was so sure that God had called me into the ministry, the pulpit ministry, that I knew that if He called me, there would be an open door. And my life was in His hands. And wherever He guided me, or if doors were closed in one place, I knew He would open a door in another place. And that's what happened.
Okay.
Because the Congregational Methodists did accept women preachers, and they did ordain women ministers. So I went to the Congregational Methodist Church and was ordained an elder in that denomination, and held elders' orders for a long time.
Okay.
For 10 years, I pastored in the Congregational Methodist Church.
You pastored, okay, so tell me about the churches that you pastored, and then I want to talk about your ordination in the United Methodist Church.
All right. The two churches I pastored in the Congregational Methodist Church was Mount Ida Church near Geneva, Alabama.
Okay.
And then I pastored one above Ozark, Alabama, Concord. After a few years, the churches started growing. And the one in Concord was really a big church. They were strong and wanted full-time.
Okay, so you were pastoring two churches.
I was.
Okay.
Living here in Hartford with my parents. I would drive to Geneva there, and I would go up on the weekends, and they had a place for me to stay in Ozark. And during my ministry there, we built a new church. In fact, my name is on the cornerstone of that church. And when we finished, we were debt-free. And it's still active. And I go back there for homecomings quite often. And I go back for funerals and different things. I still return. And I meet quite a few people here and there who remembered those days that we had at Concord. But in 1956, the Methodist at General Conference, they voted to accept women for ordination in the pulpit ministry.
Now, for people that don't know, the General Conference would be the national meeting of
the United Methodist Church now, as we know it, the United Methodist Church.
Okay.
And it just so happened that the minister in the Methodist Church in Ozark, Alabama, had been out to Concord several times and heard me preach. And the year 1956, that Methodist Conference, General Conference, opened the doors to women. Charles Liddell was moved from the Ozark First Methodist Church to district superintendent over the Dothan district. And Charles called me and said, "Jean, we want you to come home. You are a Methodist and you belong to us, and we want you to come home." And so I did. I came and started my studying, started my preparation, and he said, "I will give you a church this year. I'll give you an appointment. I'll give you a good appointment." Back then, is far different than now. The churches really didn't know who would be their preacher until they got to conference. And the church where I was appointed had a young man in the general conference, at the general conference, to accept or reject the preacher. And when he found out he was having a lady preacher, he turned white, pale, and said, "We can't do that."
Did he give reasons for that?
He said, he called his home church, and they said, "Oh, no."
And which church was this now?
Geneva, Westside, Geneva, Alabama.
Okay.
A good appointment, good big church, nice church, strong church. "No, we can't do that." But may I tell you that they rejected me, but the conference sent them a man preacher that really had been kind of notorious for his service, and he moved on after a year or so. And they were so unhappy with him before the year was over. I understand they said, "Where is that woman they wanted to send us? Is she still available?"
Now, in that time when this other minister was at that church, did you have an opportunity or anything to get to know any of the people at that church? Did they become more familiar with you during that time?
See, they knew me because I had lived in Geneva. I graduated from Geneva High School. And they knew me, and they knew that I had answered the call to preach. But it was just the fact that they had never had a lady preacher. They had never heard of a lady preacher being in the Methodist Church. And so I was rejected.
Because you were a female. No other reason was given. Okay.
I was just a female. So they sent me to a charge in Uriah, Alabama. And I stayed there for 6 years. Amazing what happened in those 6 years. Cannot tell you.
So before we talk about that, let's back up just a minute. Were you ordained in the United Methodist Church when you took the first pastorate?
Yes, I had I received my deacon's orders, but not my elders. But I had already received my deacon's orders.
Okay.
And, there are certain educational qualifications to become an elder. And I had not reached those qualifications, so I was ordained a deacon.
Okay.
And then, after I served 6 years on the Uriah charge of the United Methodist Church, I then became conference evangelist.
Okay.
And I had, at that time, done most of my educational work. I went to Bernard College in Oskaloosa, Iowa, in University Park. And that was a 4-year college, one of the top 10.
Did you
College.
move there, or did you do your degree through
No,
correspondence?
I moved. I stayed
Okay.
on campus there.
Okay.
Yeah. And then I came and I went to Troy State Teachers College for my liberal arts work, to my BS.
Okay.
And while I was there, after that, I became conference evangelist.
And that was in what year?
I would say that in the 60s, something in there.
So you roughly spent 15 or so years in the pastoral ministry?
In the pastoral ministry at that time.
Okay.
And as a conference evangelist, I had my own board. And I had businessmen, church people, friends serving on that board. We had a treasurer and everything. And I just preached. I was preaching revivals everywhere. Sometimes I would have to leave one with only 2 or 3 days to get to my other church. I was never without a church waiting for me. In fact, I'd give you an interesting thing to show you how God has directed and been in my life. I have now been in the ministry over 70 years. There has never been one day that I didn't have someone waiting for me. Not one in all these 70 years. I stayed in evangelism. The board may put me on salary, and of course I was paid through the board. Well, it was about around 1970 probably, I think. The General Conference had moved that we had to start integrating with our brothers and sisters of another race. And there was a lot of confusion in our conference, in the Alabama West Florida Conference. I had gone to the East Bruton United Methodist Church, First Church in East Bruton, for a revival. Some of the churches had, at that time, talked about leaving and pulling out.
Because of the integration issue.
Yeah. And there was just a lot of discord and unrest. And the SPR committee wrote a letter to the bishop.
And SPR would be?
The Pastor Parish Relations Committee.
Okay. And is this a conference committee?
They have the church every church in the Methodist Church has an SPR that has to do with the people, the preacher's salary, and they set all that kind of stuff. And they wrote a letter in 100% asking that the bishop send me to the East Bruton Church as their pastor. and stated, if you will send her, we will not pull out of the Methodist Church. And so the bishop called me, and my DS called me, and said, Jean, would you help us out? And I had been in a conference evangelist for about 2 years. And during that 2 years, I traveled halfway around the world. I went to Japan, Korea, Hong Kong, Africa. I went all over as a missionary with the Ordained Missionary Society. The Ordained Missionary Society offered me an international position with them. And I turned it down because I just really felt that that was not my calling. But I did have that honor to be asked to do that. I did drop my supporters for a while. I wrote a letter and said, if you will hold your contributions in my ministry, I'm going to drop out for 1 year and then we'll go back. But I never did go back. Perhaps in retrospect, I think I missed my first calling there.
Is that to to your first calling to be a missionary?
No, my first calling was to be an evangelist.
Okay.
Evangelistic work.
Okay.
Not a pastor. But I had made a commitment when I was ordained an elder.
So when you finish that part, I want to talk about you becoming an ordained elder. So you stopped being an evangelist.
Yes. And they sent me to that church,
okay.
to the East Room Church.
Now, were they open to integration once you got there? Is that
no?
Okay.
No. That's the reason they wanted me to come. They wouldn't pull out of the Methodist Conference. And see, the bishop asked me would I do that. Well, I had made the commitment when I received my orders that I would go where I was sent. And when the bishop said, will you go where you're sent? I said, yes, I will. And see, I was then really, I was pulled both ways. But I felt like I had to keep my word. And I did. I dropped out and I pastored that church. And while I was there, we built a big, beautiful, beautiful pastoral pastor's house, and all paid for.
That's the second time you've built something
yes.
debt-free, right?
Yeah. Yes.
So when were you...
Not just the second time. This was about the third. We built Sunday school rooms and educational buildings on my first appointment. It's amazing, isn't it?
Well, that's the way to do it.
Yeah.
Certainly.
But now, where are we?
So I wanted to ask you about when you became an ordained elder. Do you remember what year that was?
I think that probably, I looked for my certificates. They're here somewhere. I've only moved here less than a year. And all my things are some of my things. And I'm sure that in my office I have my ordination papers and stuff, but they're under something.
But roughly, what year was it?
I would think that it had to be, let me see, I was in 44, 50, 60, something, close to 70, probably 68 or
okay.
69. And I perhaps was the first lady to be ordained an elder.
So tell me that story. Your family has shared some of that story with me, and they said that you and another woman's name went through close to the same time?
Miss Lucy Hathaway and I were somewhere in there, and there's a question mark as to which one really received their orders first or second, which in that time frame. So it doesn't matter. We were among the very first.
At least the first two.
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So,
To be ordained an elder. And an elder is the highest orders you can have in the Methodist Church.
did that change anything for you when you became an ordained elder? Did it give you opportunities you did not have I guess it was the ordained deacon preceding that office?
Yes.
Okay, so once you were an ordained elder, how did that change?
Well, back then, deacons were not permitted to serve communion or to marry or anything. But that elder's orders gave you the right to do that. And, of course, it was quite an honor to be ordained an elder. And you had to finish all of your educational qualifications in order to become an elder, and I had done that.
Was it controversial among this conference that a woman was to be ordained as an elder?
Well, all these years, people have said, Gina, I know you had a real hard time because you were a pioneer. You blazed the trail. And that's true. But you know what? I've never looked at anything that's ever happened to me as being a hardship. And people will say, well, Jean, back then I'm sure you just had a hard time. And I didn't. It was not easy. You were not appointed. Churches back then had not heard of women preachers. But once they appointed me, I stayed. Stayed at one church 10 years. I stayed at another church 7 years. And I just had, a little sidetrack funny thing. A lady came up to me at conference one day and said, Jean, we were thinking about asking for you as our pastor, but somebody told us that if we got you, we could never get rid of you.
I guess there are worse things that could be said about a pastor, isn't there?
Yes. So, that is the truth. Now, I was the first lady to be elected as a delegate to the General Jurisdictional Conference.
The first woman.
That was the first lady clergy woman
In the United States?
in our conference.
Okay.
In the Alabama West Florida.
Okay.
I was the first lady to ever serve on the board of ordained ministers. I was the first lady to serve on the board of evangelists. I was the first lady to serve on missions. I just was I blazed the trail all down through our Methodist, through our conferences. And I served on boards in a local conference in our district superintendents and all this. I served on boards there and agencies and just had a great ministry. But I have never served a church, and this I give God the glory. I have never served a church when I was in full-time ministry that didn't grow numerically, financially, and spiritually. Never. I have had the privilege of enlarging churches, renovating churches, baptizing people, having great camp meeting revivals, seeing people saved and filled with the Holy Spirit, come to know the Lord. There are many men, young men, answered the call to preach under my ministry. I've received letters, and people have come to me over and over. Jean, you will the calls on your ministry. I answered the call to preach. In fact, our pastor right now at that First Methodist Church here, I was in a revival at his church when he answered the call to the ministry.
Is that right?
Yes. And I've just had wonderful experiences. I had the privilege of going with the Oriental Missionary Society to Hualien, Taiwan. It's a place where the tribal people lived. And they were one generation removed from headhunting. And I had the privilege of receiving from some of the tribal people that had once been, their ancestors had been headhunters. I had a whole attire, the dress wear they wore the night they would catch someone and kill them.
And you preached the gospel to
I preached the gospel to them. I had to speak through there were 3 interpreters, English and Cantonese and Mandarin, and then the tribal language. We were out in the wooded area, and they had a little dinner bell they would ring, and people would start coming from everywhere, and they had the different tribal, tattoos on their face and all of that, and their chickens and goats and everything else came along with them. And that's when I spoke through 3 interpreters. There were 4 of us. I've often wondered really what they heard.
Right, because of the interpreter.
Yeah.
Did you see anybody converted during those meetings?
I didn't really see that. I was with the missionaries that were working with those people, and I have prayed and thought and hoped that my going. And one of the things I remember most was in all those little tribal meetings where I went, they always brought a gift of rice. They had sacrificed. The minister there would say, Jean, they've been bringing little grains of rice for you. They knew you were coming.
That's an interesting story.
And they always brought me a little rice. They had big cane, and they would boil it out and pack the rice in that. Mm. And I remember one time they brought me a little 6-pack package of rice that was packed down in those little canes. And they had been bringing that rice sacrificially for a long time to give to me. Was a gift.
So this was their offering.
This was their offering.
That's a world of difference between that and maybe how Americans approach offerings.
I've used that many times, many times.
So once you became ordained, you pastored, but then you continued to evangelize. When did you leave the pastoral ministry?
I retired in 1949.
Okay. 49?
49.
Okay.
No, 89.
89, okay. And you retired as a pastor?
I retired, and I was the pastor in the First Methodist Church in Grand Bay, Alabama, and I retired there. And I had a friend that owned two mortuaries in Mobile, and he said, "Jean, when you retire, I want you to come work with me." So I worked as a counselor for the funeral homes for 6 years. That was quite an experience. And on the weekends, I would go fill in for people and do things of that nature, you know.
And you continue to do that today. You preached this morning, correct?
As I did this morning.
Okay.
I've never retired. I've filled in 5 different churches whose pastor had to resign or got sick or all of this, and I have been that person, that's go-to in all of these churches, that I've never stopped.
Now, are you writing new sermons?
Yes.
Okay.
In fact, I preached one this morning I had never preached before.
Okay. You probably don't have to. You
I
probably
don't,
have enough.
that's you know, that's just so true. It's amazing. I remember the bishop came to me one time, Bishop Jackson, and he said, "Jean, I want to put you on a district. But he said, you would have to promise me that you would absolutely go by and encourage your people to go by all of our teachings." And at that time, there was a lot of confusion about the National Council of Churches and a lot of things that I absolutely did not agree with. And I said, "Bishop, I appreciate that, but I would not compromise the Word of God and my calling and my belief in order to be a district superintendent." I really wanted to tell him in order to be a bishop, much less a district superintendent. But I've never compromised the Word. And I left out one of the most interesting parts of my whole ministry. May I tell it now?
Yes, ma'am.
When I was in Bernard College, at Bible College, the Bethlehem camp where I was converted, the president of that camp wanted me to go and give my testimony, and I did. At the end of the testimony, he simply said, "I know that you would like to help Miss Jean become a minister and answer her call." They made up enough money to send me to college my first year. They had to stop. It was coming in from everywhere. And so they had to stop. And I was there for 2 years and gave out money. Really, the first year, end of the first year. And if you were studying for the clergy, for the ministry, we were assigned to the college chapel. We had to speak. And so on my assignment, there was a little lady named Mrs. Bingham that came from across the street and heard me preach. The next morning, the dean of women called me in her office and said, "Jean, Mrs. Bingham would like to see you in her home." I said, "Who is Mrs. Bingham?" She said, "She's a lady that you need to know. And she lives right here at the end of the walkway." I had walked by her house several times going to my different classes. And she had a big apple tree in the front of her yard. I said, "The only thing I know about Mrs. Bingham, I have prayed that an apple would fall in my hand as I walked under that tree, but it never did." Ms. Fogel said, Well, I think maybe she would give you one of those apples if you would go over there. I went. Long story. She said, I heard you preach this morning. I said, yes, ma'am. She said, I liked what I heard. And she said, I came home and prayed for you. And the Lord told me that you needed some money. And she said, is that right? I said, Mrs. Bingaman, did God tell you that? I said, he's never told me anything that was wrong. Yes, I said, in fact, I'm out of money now. And I've told him that he'd have to supply it. I knew no way in the world how he would. She said, all of your college is taken care of from now on. She paid for all my college work. Every dime. Sent me through college. Now, is that not a story of God's grace? He will not call you or ask you to do anything. He will not supply your every need to do it. And that, I would come home and run revivals, and at the beginning of each year, she would call me and say, a little bird told me I've already paid your tuition. You don't have to pay anymore. He has supplied all of my needs and the most of my wants. And he continues to do it.
That is a fascinating story. Did you, were you able to stay in touch with her after college?
Oh yes, I was. I did stuff for her. I would drive her around. She owned 6 sections of wheat things in Canada. And of course, you could only bring so much money over here. She had a Bible college, students in Bible college over there. And she had some 25 or 30 of us that she was paying the way through college. One of our big buildings on the campus was Bingaman Hall. She was just a little tiny lady that you would never believe.
How would your ministry have been different if you had not met her? Would it have affected your ordination? Is that the primary?
I don't think it would affect. I'm not sure because I can't ask God where he would have sent me, but I'm sure that somewhere, some way, he would not have left me in Iowa without some permanent assurance that he was there every step of the way. And let me share with you that many times I have failed him. But I can tell you this morning, he has never failed me.
Well, that is a powerful testimony to that, for sure.
He has never failed me.
So let's look now at at some of your thoughts on current ministry in the United Methodist Church in the United States. What have been some of the biggest changes you've seen in the United Methodist Church over the course of your ministry, good or bad?
Well, you know, the United Methodist Church, at that time it was the Methodist Church. Mm-hmm. You know, John Wesley is the founder, of course, of our Methodist Church. And it was he who discovered that we were saved by grace through faith. It's not of works lest any man should boast, but it is a gift from God. And then John Wesley felt as if there was a deeper work of grace in the heart of man. and he called it sanctification, to be sanctified holy. And it was John Wesley who said, if the Methodist Church ever stops preaching heart purity and holiness of life, they are indeed a fallen people. Well, I have lived long enough, and I have seen changes that would break your heart. Because in the Methodist Church today, in some areas, John Wesley would not recognize his church. We've marginalized the Bible in some places. And I remember Jeremiah wrote a book on I Never Thought I'd See the Day. And then he named those things. And I too can say that. I never thought I would see the day that our Methodist preachers would be marrying same-sex couples. I never thought I would see the day when we no longer honored our discipline. We each are going our same way. We are very, very so liberal. Our church has become so liberal. And I hate to criticize, and I'm not, I'm just being factual. It seems that we have forgotten our mission, our message, and our master. That's a good sermon. We no longer adhere to the Word of God in some areas. We still have people who are dedicated, who love the Lord, who believe that God came and sent His Son to redeem us. But in some areas, the Word of God is not really being preached and ignored. And I see that so much. And all you have to do is look at statistics. The Methodist Church has lost millions of people, members of our church. In fact, in all of our churches, it seems that we have lost the zeal and the power and the presence of God that has one time been involved in our church and our services. You'd see people coming hungry and thirsting for the Word of God, surrendering their lives and being saved and filled with the Holy Spirit. But our altars are empty. Our pews are vacant. Our services are cold. Our eyes are dry. And our knees are no longer calloused. As a result, many of our little churches out in the country only have a very few, and it's just a matter of time before many of them are going to be closed. In fact, I just heard this week that one of our huge churches in Mobile, Spring Hill Avenue, big, nice one, closed already. That's what's happened. And we have already have a new name for maybe the church that's coming out from the United Methodist Church.
Like a split in the church?
Split.
Okay, what's that name?
The Westland Covenant Association. And there's already been a conference in Chicago.
Is that something that you know enough about that you think that that's a legitimate movement, that that's a step in the right direction?
Well, you see, we have, they have been trying for years. When I was a delegate at the General Conference, or a jurisdiction General Conference, in 1984 was the first year that I remember they started voting on ordaining gays. And we have been fighting that battle for all these 50 years. And it looks like now, I know that they have just appointed a lesbian as bishop. And I understand in one of the most liberal conferences that when she visited the church, they stood and gave her a standing ovation. Now, you know God is not going to bless that. I know that. And so my heart aches to know what we have been and what we could be, as opposed to what we are today.
Now, what would you say to a young woman who sensed God's call to ministry in a faith tradition or a denomination that was not friendly towards women serving in pulpit ministry? What few pieces of advice would you give that young lady?
Well, I've had many women to come to me and ask me about their calling and what have you. And here's what I have always said. Whether it's male or female, if you can do anything else, never answer the call to preach. But if you cannot, if you come to that place where you know that God has called, the call of God is upon your heart, and you can no longer deny it, and you are not happy anywhere else, then you can answer that call, and God will make a way for you.
What about, what advice would you have for young men and women who are being appointed to their first pastorate? What advice would you give a new pastor?
In any denomination?
Any denomination, any new pastor.
I would advise them to, first of all, come to know their parishioners. And in knowing them, I would advise them not to make any changes, radical changes, but let the Holy Spirit guide them. If there's a change that needs to be made, do it gently. Do not lord over anyone. I always told my people, I'm not here to lord over you. I'm here to be one of you, as to guide you by the Holy Spirit. God has called me to do one thing. He's called you to do another. I'm not any more important than you are to Him. He just asked me to gently be here on this position, and you have a calling in your life. You have. And that's exactly the way I have dealt with my first parishioners. I have tried to know who they are. I have tried to gently lead them into a deeper depth to know God. But whether you are the first year or the last year, you depend on the one above. Where Jesus said, I go away, or if I go not away, the Comforter will not come, and when He has come, He'll guide you into all truth. And until He comes, you can't do anything anyway. If you try to do it, you'll make a mess of it. But trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus but to trust and obey.
Well, that's a wonderful way to wrap up our interview. Do you have any other thing you would like to say that we did not cover in this interview?
Nothing I know.
Okay. Well, that wraps up this interview with Reverend Gene Spikes in Hartford, Alabama. This interview is done for Regent University School of Divinity in Virginia Beach, Virginia, for Women in the History of Christianity for Dr. Kimberly Alexander. Thank you, Reverend Spikes.
Well, does that do kind of what?
That is more than I could have ever dreamed that interview would be.